All right. So both of the words on the screen might strike you as things that ought to be obvious. It ought to be plain that we do these things. And the way that the market currently exists for descaling and for DevOps, both of them are a little bit weird. So I want to start with basics. I want to make certain that what we do is something that's going to be concrete and lands. We're not going to be talking a lot of philosophy today. So to begin with, DevOps has a heritage. And in particular, the second way in DevOps, amplify feedback loops. Well, DevOps derives from feedback loops that originated with XP. That's not to say that XP covers DevOps. It doesn't. But the lessons learned with XP still stand up. All of the feedback loops that we used back then, they're still valuable in a DevOps context. So we can think that the second way is a proper superset of XP. Well, that's been attempted before. The manifesto was based on XP. Back in the day, there really wasn't very much talk about Scrum. Yes, there was a paper published and there was a little group, but all of the early Agile literature was about XP. So the reason that we moved to this word Agile was because there were a bunch of people who were trying to horn in on the brand for Extreme. Extreme was kind of difficult to sell anyway. The trouble is that what we did in trying to set up Agile for success, to give room for a whole bunch of little methods, including DSDM and Crystal and Scrum and so on, at the time, little methods. Well, they were all pretty much the same. XP was the big fish in the water. No, it is no longer. Scrum is the big fish in the water, and the trouble is that a lot of the fundamentals that we had in this thing have been clobbered by people who are selling certificates. What we really want to do is generate good business outcomes for clients. So the 3 DevOps ways are much closer to the original intent. We know that Agile has failed to deliver these outcomes in the large. At a team level, it works. People are very happy with the outcomes they get for teams and projects. But there's this terrible statistic that came out of the most recent CollabNet version 1 State of Agile survey, which is the largest and longest running survey in the Agile world, that only 4% of respondents said Agile helps their organizations adapt to changing market conditions. That's the 4th value, responding to change over following a plan. So what went wrong? Well, the meat of the manifesto was in its principles, not in these 4 vague value statements. And even the principles were stated in a way that was too bloody vague. Pardon my Australian vernacular. So if we don't take care of these principles in DevOps, we're going to fail in exactly the same way. And this is what really drives us into this descaling conversation. The original principle, I've picked out 5 of the 12 principles because these are the 5 where I see the biggest compromises made. The idea that architecture's requirements and designs emerge from self-organizing teams doesn't talk about product owners. How could we get business stakeholders, design stakeholders, technical stakeholders, operations stakeholders to collaborate in a self-organizing team to generate these architecture's requirements and designs? There's nothing in Agile that does that. And to be able to get descaling to support self-organizing teams, we need a simple set of patterns. We're going to look at some of them in this talk really quickly because I only have 20 minutes. Simplicity, the art of maximizing the amount of work not done. No one knows how to do that. That was a way of trying to say something that was said much better in XP. Yagni, you aren't going to need it. I ask Agilists every time I meet them, what's Yagni, and they have no idea. It's astonishing to me. This was such a fundamental principle in XP. you couldn't possibly do without it. The idea is very simple. We want to flatten the cost of change curve. So the only way we can do that is by avoiding doing things we're going to need. We only want to do the things we need right now. And there are perfectly good arguments that Ron Jeffries put up back in the day to justify this principle. The moment it got turned into the art of maximizing the amount of work not done, it's blown out of the water. We need this fundamental idea, not just in delivery, in change programs as well. When we see transformations that push vast amounts of change, work in progress, then we're missing this. But it's more fundamental than that. Backlogs violate Yagni. There's lots to say about that I'm not going to have time to talk about now, so that's okay. Continuous attention to technical excellence and good design. Everybody knows this means refactoring. But we have frameworks that say, as SAFe does, that refactoring is work that must be estimated, scheduled, and planned along with other work. No, we have to continuously and mercilessly pay off technical debt. It's the only way we're going to be able to flatten cost of delivery, cost of quality, cost of change curves. Business people and developers must work together daily throughout the project, not once every 3 months and not at an arm's remove. This was all about getting the kind of immediate feedback, the kind of tight feedback loops that are embodied in DevOps to be front and center. And the fact that this was dropped on the ground because it got tucked away in some list of principles behind the main manifesto, that was a tragedy. But finally, and worst, the most efficient and effective method of conveying information to and within a development team is face-to-face conversation. We have plenty of face-to-face conversation that happens within our delivery and DevOps teams. But conveying information to those teams should be face-to-face? Yes, it should. Because without that face-to-face, we wind up with long loops and slow conversation, slow communication of learnings, and that generates vast amounts of politics. It generates terrible game theoreticians. If DevOps is going to succeed where Agile has failed, it has to learn the lessons of the failure. These principles cannot be allowed to languish on the ground. We have to pick them up. I'm going to talk about descaling specifically now in terms of metrics. And the metrics are incredibly simple, but you know the old gold rat saying that if you don't measure it, you can't optimize it. So the first of these metrics, minimum feedback frequency. What's the longest any decision in your organization goes unreviewed? If your answer to that is 3 months, well, then you can't possibly respond to change on the time frame of a week or a day. And business requires you to respond to those things. If we think about the market as a place where there are constraints, and there must be bottlenecks in the market the same way as there exist bottlenecks in technology and in our organizations. And for us to be able to prioritize opening bottlenecks, we have to be able to respond immediately. If minimum feedback frequency is months or even weeks, then we have a massive problem to solve. Maximum meeting size. What's the largest meeting your organization needs to make a decision? If it's about 120 odd people or maybe more in a big room planning meeting, that's not very good. What we really want is to be able to farm out responsibility for doing particular kinds of work, whether the work is about value flow or workflow improvements or learning flow improvements. Transformation should be about the latter. If we can farm it out to small teams and give them responsibility, autonomy over the decisions that we need them to make, then we have some hope of responding rapidly. Without that, if we have to do this in a large room, then the hippo's always going to win. Highest paid person's opinion. And command and control hierarchies will grow up automatically when we put a lot of people in a room. 6 people is the ideal size for a self-organizing team, not 7 plus or minus 2, and certainly not 125. So then the ratio of direct to indirect decisions, we call this delegation collaboration ratio. When we add an extra person to that team of 6, automatically, whether you give them a title of Scrum Master or Project Manager or whatever, they automatically, whoever is the most empowered or the most valuable or simply the one that's best connected within the little team will wind up becoming a middleman for the others. And the ratio then goes from basically 0 for a self-organizing 6-person team to 1 for one of these little managed teams, because of the natural tendency for conversations, and especially decision-making conversations, to flow through whoever is in the middle. When we enlarge the size, they enlarge the length of the loops. If we don't have some way to get learnings to flow across hierarchy, then this delegation collaboration ratio thing will kill us. And the deeper the hierarchy, the exponentially greater is that ratio. The worse the game theoretics, the worse the politics, the more distrust evolves. And I think everybody's aware that when we get up to the size of a traditional division or portfolio in large enterprises, in the previous picture, the left hand didn't know what the right hand was doing. Here, the left hand doesn't even know the right hand exists. And we get all kinds of dreadful smells that, if we were looking at code, we would factor away. Descaling is very much like refactoring in that sense. The final one of the metrics, people are well aware of the Dunbar limit, I think, after the Spotify videos. And everybody says, well, you have to stay well away from the 150 people in your group. The question would be, what's the size of the smallest fully autonomous group? 150, unfortunately, well, Dunbar is the same age as I am. So he was asked about this. It's not like he was some guy hacking his way through a forest 100 years ago. And he said, no, this is for an isolated subsistence level village would be 150. In a densely interconnected multi-network corporation, it's going to be much smaller than that. And here we have some data. This data comes from a study of the world of Warcraft that was done about 10, 15 years ago. It's about the distribution of sizes of guilds. The social groups in the world of Warcraft are guilds. 95% of them have 54 members or less. And what that's really telling us is that 50 to 60 really ought to be the Dunbar limit for working inside the corporations where we're going to do DevOps. Without paying attention to that, we wind up again with evolution of distrust and bad game theoretics that stymie any kind of improvement that we could put in, because that loop, that beautiful second way loop, it'll wind up getting log jammed by those game theoretics and that politics. So I am intentionally going as fast as possible, and I apologize for that, but I'm going to get through this thing. I hope that's okay with you. I don't really know how to stick to 20 minutes, but I think we're doing it right. Anyway, the US military, well, the military in general, have many lessons learned about what we have to do to get around problems of scale. And in particular, there's this wonderful gentleman, von Moltke, 19th century Prussian field marshal, who said this wonderful thing: no plan survives contact with the enemy. Everyone remembers that part of the quote, but the rest is just as valuable, if not more. Each officer acts on the basis of his own view of the situation, and productive action is controlled by the superior framework of intent. Ooh, the superior framework of intent, that sounds like a really important thing. How do we deal with that in a DevOps context? Well, let's stay on the military theme for a moment. First World War wasn't very important. Everyone was stuck in trenches. Command and control could work. But by the time we got to the Second World War, the French had not learned this mission command lesson. They were still using command and control, and they built this massive super fortress all along their border with Germany. The Germans did learn it. And I'm not saying for a moment that agile Nazis are a good thing. Agile Nazis were a terrible thing. Unfortunately, they were a real thing, and they swarmed around through Belgium to get into France, and they took the entire country in 5 days using mission command. The same deal went at sea. The British had to get resupplied from the rest of the Commonwealth after France fell. They couldn't get supply from the continent anymore, and so they had these massive fleets that were supplying them. The Germans put together these U-boat fleets, wolf packs, that each of the boats was patrolling a separate patch of ocean looking for diesel smoke over the horizon. When they saw it, they would radio the others. They would assemble at the location of the fleet, surface at night. And the days before sonar or radar, they just needed to spotlight the ships to torpedo them. And they sank not 60% of the ships, but 60% of the fleets. So this is a tremendously powerful way to generate descaling. It's just not quite enough. The problem that command and control solved was this combinatorial explosion of conversations that we talked about before. And if we put together a little product squad with business, design, and technical and operational stakeholders meeting to a really tight agile cadence so we can get that little loop to zip around the second wave loop really fast, well, we still have to worry about how we can get alignment between the squads as they learn things. Now, this is where Spotify evolved this neat pattern. Forget the rest of this. This is a complicated looking picture of a bunch of little squads. It's the chapters that are important here. What they did was they said, okay, let's look at people of common competence. So all of the analysts across the squads in a tribe form a chapter, and it meets once a week. All of the developers form a separate chapter that meets once a week, and actually you get those chapters to meet at the same time, so the squads are not starved of any competence. So all the chapters meet at the same time, and then you run your squad retros. And that means each retro can then react not just to learnings within its squad, but learnings that come from other squads in the same tribe. Brilliant idea. Slight problem. That lets each squad respond to the needs of the others, but it doesn't help with decisions about cross-cutting concerns. So happily, the real tribal societies faced this problem and solved it centuries ago. And the best example of this I know is a very successful American Indian First Nations people called they call themselves Haudenosaunee. The Europeans call them the Iroquois. They were at their height somewhere between 250,000 and 500,000 people. They used these systems, descaling systems, for over 500 years as a dominant political power on that continent. They came to grief in the War of Independence, the American War of Independence, and the War of 1812. We don't have time for that story now. But suffice to say, these were not wandering bands living in teepees. These people lived in permanent structures they called longhouses. They farmed sustainably for hundreds of years. They invented ways to do these things. The Haudenosaunee means the people who build, engineers. They were an engineering society. And the way that they organize themselves is tremendously valuable for us to understand. So I'm not going to go into any depth now because I don't have time for it. But suffice to say, they had matriarchal clans that cut across their longhouses in the same way as the chapters cut across the squads in the Spotify model. The key that they came up with to descaling, the key pattern, was that they had councils of representatives of the clans, of the chapters, not of the individual longhouses, not of the squads. So they didn't do a scrum of scrums. Each clan or each chapter would get aligned on proposals for treaties between the longhouses, and then those would be represented face to face in a little council of representatives of the clans. So I don't have time to talk about, they used this structure at all different levels, at tribal levels, at national levels, international levels. I don't have time at the moment to talk about all of that stuff. Suffice to say, when you get up to the level of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, they basically use this longhouse pattern as a social structure, not just a building structure. So the Confederacy was a longhouse of longhouses of longhouses of longhouses of longhouses. 5 different levels of consensus decision-making, of autonomy and alignment. At every level, they were only concerned with treaties between the components of the level below. Those treaties could not overrule the internal treaties of each of those social groups. So this is a Haudenosaunee map of the Haudenosaunee. Every bead, a village, every row of beads, string of beads, a tribe, which is to say a bunch of villages along a river or a watercourse or some geographic feature. And then you see that there are dots there. There's a set of tribes between each dots. Each of those is a nation. So an incredibly dense social weave, and lots of things about their marriage system made this work as well. We don't have time to go into that now. And obviously we can't get the people in our organizations to be marrying each other. However, the patterns from the great law of peace, those are things we can souvenir. We're not going to become the Haudenosaunee. This is not about cultural misappropriation. We are not pretending to be American Indians. The point of this is these guys came up with some solutions that work and worked for many centuries in very difficult circumstances, and we can learn from them. So I want to talk about a specific one of those. This is an idea called leadership as a service, or you could think of it as decide the decider. We already do something like this. If you're doing planning poker and you have people polarized on the estimate, then you'll go, well, okay, if you guys can't agree within a short period of time, if you can't agree in, let's say, the next 2 minutes, this is a database story, I'm going to hand it to Jill. She's our DBA. She can produce the estimate. So that idea of handing an estimate or a decision to an individual, if the group can't get to a unanimous consensus, that's this decide the decider idea. The reason we call it leadership as a service is this gives us a protocol that we can apply to generating servant leadership, which is to say generating self-organization in our teams. So leadership as a service, we can combine with, well, it includes another couple of patterns, in particular one we get from Apple. The idea there was directly responsible individuals. Jill's our DRI for something to do with database. We can have different DRIs for different functional areas or different metrics. We can have different DRIs for different backlog items or agenda items in a meeting. And the trick is that the DRI carries responsibility for executing whatever the decision is for that item, but they don't have an ability to overrule the rest of the group. They will only be asked for leadership as a service if the rest of the group can't get unanimous within some period of time. So there are interviews where Jobs claims that there were no committees inside Apple. He's talking about this protocol. And again, I don't have time to go into detail. So I do want to give you a little illustration how we could combine together these sorts of metrics and patterns. There's a game, a simulation we play in the same sense as the agile team level games. We actually play this with Lego the same way as a lot of team level games are played, but this is a game for demonstrating wholly descaled organizations with no command and control, no managers, no owners, no masters. The collaboration delegation ratio is just 1 for a group of up to 160 people. Maximum meeting size of 6 people, again for a group of up to 160. And the minimum feedback frequency is 20 minutes, not weeks, not days. I'm not saying that this is realistic. I'm saying this is a really good way to get a feeling for what it's like to do this. And we've run this, we call it the game without thrones. We've run this dozens of times in the last couple of years. So we've got a bunch of experimental results that have led to this kind of a picture. If we think of groups of 3 squads as forming some kind of work stream or value stream, and 3 of those streams forming a portfolio, this is about 50 to 60 people. This gives us a nugget we could wrap commercials around and make it a micro enterprise, or we could just say it's like a tribe or a mini portfolio inside an organization. The reason it's relevant to DevOps is it gives us a way to maximize the flow of learnings and to minimize the time through that second wave loop. In the game, we use DRIs that are based on metrics for building a single Westeros-style Lego castle. We use an awful lot of Lego in running one of these games. They're huge fun, and we've got a bunch coming up in North America and in Europe and in India and in Australasia. So if you're interested in that, you need to go to xscalealliance.org, and we have plenty of details on how you can be involved in that and so on. I'm not going to give you the whole commercial pitch. Suffice to say, each of these chapters is doing a different thing. And so we have a chapter representative. Ew, something awful happened to my formatting here. Never mind that. In fact, there's a little square box around one of these. I apologize for that. I'm not going to worry about it too much, though. You'll get the idea. So we have here 3 squads. Each is doing some delivery. And then they go and form little chapters, 3 people in each chapter. That's the ideal number to generate strong flow of learnings. If you have 2 people, then one's talking to another and guessing on it. But, you know, if you're at a conference and a third person turns up to talk to your pair of people, now we have one person who's constantly thinking, where is this conversation going? This is really brilliant for generating solid flow of learning. So if we could do many of these triples in parallel, we have a number of ways of doing it apart from Game Without Thrones, Code Without Thrones, Extreme T. It's incredibly effective. So making mini chapters works really, really well. Another thing that works really, really well is if we're going to make a council of chapter representatives, we rotate the chapter representative. So we don't have a single person from the chapter who is always on the council. We all take turns. And that means we all are meeting face to face. And we can do this at multiple levels of the organization. And again, I don't have time to go into the patterns in huge detail. This gives us a way to align workplace agreements or treaties, depending on how we want to talk about this stuff. If we have a number of streams, we can do the same thing at the next level up. So remember, we had that outer loop that was really about the portfolio or tribe or micro enterprise. We can form chapters across the streams. And then those chapters can all pick representatives to attend a portfolio council, for want of a better term. So this is not intended to be a prescription. This is only a model in the sense of, you know, Camelot in the movie, Monty Python and the Holy Grail. It's only a model. Don't take it too seriously. It's a way to play with the practice patterns. And it's the patterns that matter, and applying YAGNI to those patterns, only introducing a pattern when it solves a problem you're actually experiencing. That's key to this. So
you have 3 minutes.
Oh my God, I thought I'd be way over at this point. That's excellent. Thank you, Masa. All right, so this descaling stuff is part of a pattern language we call XSCALE. And the idea with XSCALE is we need a way to approach business agility that's similar to the way that XP approached agility in little delivery or DevOps teams. We don't need to be very specific about how our teams work. There's plenty of practice patterns out there for running the teams. That's a science now. It's no longer something we have to guess about. What we need to address is the organization of teams in a descaling way if we're going to be able to get that second loop. To tell the truth, the other 3 ways need to work in an effective learning manner as well. We have to think about building learning ecosystems to go with our delivery ecosystems. And the beauty of these patterns is they give us a way to approach ecosystem design in a breadth-first fashion.